I can't believe I'm saying this, but it has been 30 years since the release of the original Sony PlayStation. Just look at it in all of its glory. You know, when I look over and I see my PS5 there and then I see this, I'm just going, man, just the evolution of where it began to where it's at now, it has just been a crazy, crazy journey. And just for a size comparison, look at this. But getting back to this, I absolutely loved the aesthetics of the original PlayStation 1. When I first laid eyes onto it, I thought it was just the craziest thing I had ever seen, and I immediately thought to myself I needed to get my hands on one. So what I wanted to talk about today was just trying to go back down memory lane and share some stories with you guys of my own personal interactions with the PS1 when it was first getting released and when I actually acquired one for Christmas, and then some of my favorite games that I had as a child growing up. Before talking about some of the games, let's kind of go back and appreciate some of the technology that came out with the PS1 and how it revolutionized how we viewed gaming for the future. So of course, the first thing we have is the DualShock controller. Not only did it integrate a shock, like the vibrations in the controller, but you had the two analog sticks that allowed us to get a different perspective on 3D gaming. And it revolutionized how we would go about playing games for the future. And then who could forget our lovely little memory cards? This was like a collector's item in of itself because they made them look so aesthetically appealing to a kid who just looked at them and went, you know, I just want to collect them. They just look so nice, like the different transparent colors, some of the solid colors, just the way they were presented. It wasn't just a boring storage device. It was like something you felt you wanted to have in your collection for your PlayStation 1. The next thing is the PlayStation heater. Everything that you could want out of an arcade experience you got with this when you were playing those good old railgunner games such as Area 51, which is actually what is in my PS1 currently because I had to test out this gun and the game itself to make sure that it was working properly. But I love some railgun games. It gives you that arcade feel in your home and not feeling like, you know, you're gonna break the bank, just dumping a boatload of quarters into that game. I was a huge fan of the arcade growing up, so being able to play games like Area 51 in my house and not feeling like I have to dump a bunch of quarters into it was just like a huge sigh of relief, and also just gave me that excitement of bringing that arcade experience into my home. I just absolutely loved it, and I couldn't ask for anything else when I had one of these little plastic guns in my hands and being able to shoot at my TV screen. So this for me was a huge and cool piece of technology that came with the PS1, and although it came towards the end of its life cycle, it just offered that flexibility that we haven't really seen up to this point when it came to our home consoles. The LCD screen being able to hook to the back of the cool, sleek, new, slim PS1 was a game changer. And I don't know about you guys, but I can't tell you how many times growing up I got booted off the TV because somebody in my house wanted to watch TV. Now, I didn't have this growing up, but if I did have this growing up, it would have allowed that flexibility that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And we would be able to just plug it into a wall and then sit this on our lap and be able to play our favorite PS1 games wherever we wanted to and not have to worry about somebody barging in and going, I want to watch TV, and then, you know, unplugging the PS1 or whatever console you'd be playing and ruining your experience. Sadly, this screen, it's not broke, but it's hit or miss when it actually turns on all the way. And if you are an enthusiast of the PlayStation, I definitely suggest, if you can, acquire this for your collection. Now let's talk about some games, as I know you guys definitely want to hear about some games. So Crash Bandicoot was actually the first game that I ever got to play on the PS1. And for those of you that might have missed the streams where I had talked about the backstory as to how I got introduced to the PlayStation, you're going to hear it here and you'll be able to know. So I was in the 6th grade, and it was one of those days where you just got to do whatever for the day, right? It was towards the end of the year. And this kid brought in a PS1, and first and foremost, that was the first time I seen the console as well. So when I seen the console, my mind was blown. And then when he fired it up, and then there it was, Crash Bandicoot. my childhood brain could not handle everything that I was seeing. The colors and textures for back then, you gotta understand where we came from up to this point. So when I seen this and was hearing just the sound effects mixed in with just the action involved and the 3D platforming, my brain just was like, just gone. Now I know my one buddy laughs at me because I told him, I said, what used to be a satisfying sound to me was when I would hear Crash collecting the Wampa fruit, aka the mangoes, as I used to call them as a kid. But that sound was just so satisfying to me, and I don't understand why, but it was. But Crash Bandicoot to me was just a crazy good platformer, and I did play Mario 64 at this point, but I still felt that when I seen Crash Bandicoot, to me, it just felt like it added another dimension to 3D platforming. Now around that same time, I went over to a buddy of mine's house, and that was the first time I ever got to see Resident Evil 2. And I know my good buddy over at the Super Retro Force, Scorpio Sees Arcade, I know that he is in the same boat as me as far as the zombies in this game, although very pixelated in the polygon era and all that stuff, just their movements and sounds, it was very creepy back then, because again, you got to think about what we had prior to this coming out and just prior to the PlayStation in general. So being able to see these movements and hearing these sounds, it just added this crazy dimension to the horror genre that just hadn't been done yet. The first time seeing the arms busting through the windows at a random time, it just scared the crap out of me. Like, it was a good jump scare. It didn't feel like it was forced, but it was something that you could potentially see obviously happening during a zombie apocalypse. And then of course the liquor's just dropping from the ceiling and stuff like that. My God, my brain again was just so blown away at the presentation and then just the aspect of how the game operated. It was just so fantastic. Any of these games we're talking about here today, if you haven't checked them out, my goodness, you have to give them a look. Now fast forward all the way to Christmas of 1998, and that would be the year that I actually got a PlayStation for Christmas. And then funny story, my sisters were not too happy that we got a PlayStation because they looked at it as it was a Christmas gift for me instead of a family gift, because at the time I played the most video games out of my sisters. Those two wanted an N64, and then I said a PlayStation, and then, you know, the running joke, baby boy got what he wanted, and we got a PlayStation. And actually the first game that we had was Oddworld Abe's Exodus. And at first I was a little, I don't want to say, I know I said disappointed in the segment that I did over at the Super Retro Force, but I don't know really if I was disappointed or just kind of confused, if you will, because I just wasn't sure as to how the game was operating, because based off of what I seen on the commercial, I thought it was going to be a little more action-packed than what it was, but it was more of a puzzle platformer. However, that did not take away from the experience that I got, and I definitely did get enjoyment from this game, and I got a huge amount of satisfaction once I traversed all the way through and actually completed the game. Now, something with that game that I still have to do is I actually have to go back through, and good thing for retro achievements, I can go back through and actually try to collect all of the Mudokons, because that was something that I never did growing up. I did get through the game, but I did have some of those Mudokons still sadly left to be enslaved. And another great game that I was able to play as a child was Parasite Eve, and this one does have a story behind it as well. As far as I got this, sadly a family member of mine passed away. It was my Aunt Helen, and my cousin actually gave me this game when we were over at their house, and I was over there playing it, and he could tell that I was very immersed into the game, and he just was like, hey, you can have it if you want. And I was like, what? And just like my mind was blown, like, you're wanting to give me a game? Like, I just couldn't fathom it, you know? And he's like, yeah, you know, he's like, I already beat it, so if you want it, you can have it. And that was just such a a great thing to have happen to me as a kid, because I didn't have a lot of video games for the PS1 back then, and the vast majority that I did get to play, it was usually I either borrowed them from a friend or I just played them over at a friend's house. So of course, getting it from my family member also kind of, just felt really good, because, I don't want to sound like Dr. Phil or anything. It's just that sadly, we are just not very close with our extended family. And the cousin that gave me that game actually lived at that point in time about 3.5 hours away from where we were at. So we didn't really see him at all. So for him to go out of his way and give me a game, it just felt really good, and it was just something that I'll always remember, because Parasite Eve was one of the games that, for me, was one of the best RPGs that I had played in my childhood. I love the aesthetics. I love the action involved on how you operated when you were attacking and trying to defend, not just standing still, being able to run away from your enemies, so that way you actually felt like you had a sense of defense rather than in a traditional turn-based RPG. You're just sitting there and hoping that when your enemy attacks you, that it'll just say that they missed or, defended or something along those lines. This gave you the flexibility to be able to get out of the way once your opponents, or enemies rather, tried to attack you and deal damage. In the next two games I'm going to touch on, it's, again, another quick story, but I got Command and Conquer and Jersey Devil from a buddy of mine, and he just gave them to me. And again, I was very appreciative of it. He didn't want anything. He just said, here, you can have them. I beat them. I just don't want them anymore. Playing Command and Conquer, for me, that was a huge thing, because that opened me up to those strategy games where you had that overhead view and you built a base and, you were able to strategize and stuff like that. Now, I did play Dune on the Sega Genesis, but very briefly, so I never really got to immerse myself into it the way that I did with Command and Conquer. So Command and Conquer was that one that actually opened the doors to get me more involved into those strategy type games that years later I would go on to play Age of Empires 2 and StarCraft. And then Jersey Devil, I just always felt like this was an overlooked platformer. Some may think of it as just a clunky one. I personally liked it. I liked the aesthetics of it. It was kind of like a hybrid of that gothic medieval style, but also kind of that cartoony, kind of Halloween-y twist, if you will. And I just personally liked how it was. It was kind of dark, but also at the same time very, I guess you could say, kid-friendly, but didn't feel like, as almost a teenager at that point in time, it didn't feel too kiddish to where it kind of turned me away like, oh, this is a kid's game. It was something that I could definitely gravitate towards and get enjoyment from while playing. And with those two games, it always will forever make me think of the childhood buddy of mine that I had growing up that gave me those games. And when I think of him, I think of this, the stuff we did when we were hanging out, like playing with G.I. Joes or different action figures and setting up these huge bases out in his backyard, just doing all these, goofy things that young boys did back then, and just all the good times we had, because, I was friends with him from the time I was in the 4th grade. And then we just kind of drifted apart, sadly, once we got into junior high and stuff like that. But up to that point, we had a really good relationship, and we were always having a good time whenever we hung out and stuff like that. Jersey Devil and Command and Conquer, whenever I think of those games, they'll always be attached to him. And the next two games I'm going to talk about is Legend of Legaia and Metal Gear Solid. And again, both these two games were not given to me, but I borrowed these two games from another buddy of mine, different one, that I met him through another friend of mine, and he just introduced me to him because he's like, hey, I got this buddy of mine over here that he likes the same video games as you do. You guys could probably talk about this, that, and everything. I'm like, oh, all right, cool. And then, him and I hit it off, and he had Legend of Legaia, and he had beaten it already. And, he told me, he's like, oh, well, if you like RPGs, you're going to love this. So I remember he came over to my house and we popped in Legend of Legaia, and again, my mind was just blown, because at this point I've never seen an RPG that used the battle mechanics the way they did. It was like that fighting style where you had to use the directional pad and try to unlock different moves. So up to this point, the internet wasn't what it is now, so going online and trying to find the different codes and stuff like that as to how to unlock these moves, you couldn't really do unless you bought a guide. And since once we didn't have a guide, it was beyond satisfying when it would say, new skill unlocked, or, something like that. It was like said new skills and like the hyper arts and all that stuff. I'll always have the memories of, again, meeting that good buddy of mine. And sadly, it was one of those things, like, as we became adults, kind of drifted apart. Once, the work grind starts happening, and, working different shifts and stuff like that. And, months turn into years, and then years turn into, a decade-ish. So, I mean, it kind of sucks. But when I think of Legend of Legaia, it always just makes me think of when I first met him in the 8th grade, getting off the bus, and the snow was flying everywhere, and it was in the middle of winter. And then we just kind of started hanging out after that, and we started skateboarding together. And it was just a great childhood, and he was a big part of it. And then touching on Metal Gear Solid, it was the same thing. He let me borrow that because he knew I liked strategy type games, and he explained to me that it was strategy but different. It was that espionage thing, and it was just, again, blew my mind, because this idea, like the tactical things of like knocking on walls and then making the guys follow down wherever the sound was, and then you could run up behind them and then just break their necks and then just get away with it and just keep traversing through each level. It was just something that at that point, it was something fresh, something I never expected to see. And Metal Gear Solid just was one of those games that I actually began speed running without realizing I was speed running. Because once I beat the game, and I seen like it kept track of, how long it took you to get through, I was like, I'm going to try to see if I can beat that time. And I remember playing it over and over and over again. And I don't recall what my time was, but I just remembered I could play that game at that point in time and just get through it like it was just easy peasy. That is something that I'll always remember. It'll always be near and dear to me, because, again, just the stories behind it, the memories I have. And again, if you have not played Metal Gear Solid, definitely give it a shot. So another game that I'm going to be talking about is Medieval. And that game, not only is it a great game, but I got a good story, I think, a little story into my childhood that you guys might appreciate. So some of you guys that I know in our Super Retro Force group are great fans of the genre of horror, and I am as well. So this day, when I was able to actually play Medieval, I was staying over at a buddy's house. He was playing it rather, and we were just watching, me and another friend of mine that were there. It was not only I got introduced to Medieval, but it was the first time I ever watched the original Night of the Living Dead. I thought it was going to be boring, because it was so old. I was like, it's probably not going to have a whole lot of blood or blah, 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 blah. But I had such a great appreciation for it on how it was presented, and I was just absolutely in love with it and was like, oh my God, this is such a great movie. So I got introduced to that, and then I also got introduced to banana peppers and pepperoni as a combination on a pizza. And I remember them busting my chops because they said something about banana peppers, and I was like, what's a banana pepper? And they're like, oh my God, you gotta have them, it's so good. And they asked me if I liked salt and vinegar chips at all. I'm like, yeah, I like them. They're basically telling me that's kind of like that, but pepper, that you put on pizza, and the way that it tastes with the pepperoni, it's really good. And they weren't lying. But I absolutely love the combination of pepperoni and banana pepper on pizza. The other thing that was cool about that night as well is not only did we get to play Medieval, not only did I get to play Night of the Living Dead, but laser tag was a big thing back then. And to be able to have a set and be able to play it outside with these guys, it was just something I'll forever remember. I know it's something very simple, but it's something that is attached to Medieval as well. So anytime that I'm playing it, those memories just rush back in, and it's just something I'll never forget. Mega Man X4, that was another one that kind of hit me hard as a kid growing up, because that was the first one where you got to play as Zero. And again, as a kid, my mind was blown knowing that I could play as Zero, because after seeing him in Mega Man X for the first time, I was like, who the hell is this guy? Why can't I play as him? Screw Mega Man, I want to play as Zero. The same buddy that introduced me to Medieval was the same one that introduced me to Mega Man X4. I just couldn't be more appreciative of him allowing me to borrow it, to be able to play it, and then being able to traverse the game playing as both Zero and Mega Man. And the last game that I'm going to be talking about is Legend of Dragoon, and that one will forever have a sweet spot in my heart, not only just because It was a very well put together game, but ironically enough, it was one of the few games that I actually got from my parents, and it was the greatest hits version, and at the time I didn't care. I don't think us as kids cared if it was the it was the black label or not. So when I got this, I just was like, hey, it's a game, I'm gonna play it. And I actually got it. The quick story behind it was a girl that I was dating broke up with me, and my parents knew I was pretty upset about it. So for them to go out of their way to try to lift my spirits a bit and then get that game for me, I mean, it was huge, because it wasn't all the time that they, did stuff like that. Not saying maybe they didn't want to, but I just know, like, when we were growing up, we just didn't have a whole hell of a lot. So for them to be able to go and get that game, and the greatest hits version, I think back then were like $20, I think. For them to go out of their way to do that for me, I just, I was greatly appreciative of it. And it's one of the, I'm not saying I don't have many, but just one of the good memories I have growing up and having with my parents. So Legend of Dragoon, the gameplay, that was what drew me in. Just the timing mechanics that they had involved with it, I thought was really cool. The story with it, I can't remember the story, but I just remember as you were playing, you didn't want to stop. I got to that point because, as most RPGs go, you get those little dull spots in the beginning where they're doing the character developments and stuff like that. But once you got past that, it was like that switch clicked in my brain, and I just did not want to stop, because I just wanted to keep seeing how the story was going to progress. And I loved the aspect of when you finally got all, got your armor and everything like that, and you were able to transform. I thought it was just so cool, and something that I looked forward to while playing this game. That is all I had for this retrospective, going over the 30th year anniversary of the PS1. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments below about not only this video, but also share some memories with me that you had while the PS1 has been available to us. Thanks again for watching, and then I'll be seeing you guys in the next video.